Two, two quick questions. If Trump, for a chance, is impeached, do you feel that the backlash could result in armed civil strife? And the second question is, you were on RT, and I do watch RT from time to time. I think they have some interesting programming, but I do feel a little one-sided. I was wondering, what is your experience with RT?
Okay, well, in terms of Trump, Chomsky, let's go back to Noam Chomsky, and Chomsky says correctly that if we lose Trump and get Pence, it's going to be worse. Why? Because, and that's why I mentioned my book on the Christian right. The Trump has no ideology. It's an ideological vacuum. He doesn't, I mean, as far as I can tell, he's in the early stages of dementia. It certainly appears that way. Ronald Reagan had it, but they covered it up a little better. What he is filling that vacuum with is the fascist ideology of the Christian right. And if you think it's not fascist, flick on the TV and watch Sarah Sanders, who lies like the day is long and then tells you what a great Christian she is. I'll come back another time and talk about the Christian right, but let me just say at its core, it's about hate at its core. It's a very frightening movement. It has all the hallmarks of a totalitarian movement, and it has fused the Christian religion with the state, which the German Christian Church did. As far as RT...
Excuse me, you didn't quite answer the question. The question was, if he's impeached, will there be civil strife?
Well, yeah, but I'm saying that, one, it'll be worse, and I'm not sure that there will be civil strife because they will have Pence. Pence is a product of the Christian right. And while Trump caters to the Christian right, you have to remember that they have all these institutions they built, Liberty University with its own law school and its own systems of indoctrination through cable channels. And so I don't think there'll be civil strife because, in fact, that Christianized fascism, which this segment of the population yearns for, will become more pronounced. In terms of RT, look, if we had a functioning public broadcasting system, critics of corporate capitalism and imperialism would have a voice. But PBS in particular is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Koch brothers. And the destruction of public broadcasting, in the 60s, you could watch Baldwin, Malcolm, they were all on Zinn, Chomsky. It's vanished. And so critics such as myself are being pushed to the margins, not only of the electronic media landscape, but the internet. Now they've imposed all these algorithms in the name of fake news, of course, prop or not. Thank you, the Washington Post, this anonymous site that listed us as tools of Russia. I write for TruthDig, but all of the sites that reprint my stuff, Common Dreams, Counterpunch, they've all been targeted, and Alternet. So you get what they call impressions. So before they imposed the algorithms, if you typed in imperialism, and I had written an article recently on imperialism, it would come up. Now it doesn't. Now we charted it in TruthDig. The impressions have fallen in the last year from over 700,000 to below 200,000 as they perfect the algorithm. Alternet's traffic has fallen by 63%. World Socialist website. Then we have to add net neutrality, and the question is why? The reason is because nobody is buying this neoliberal crap, this ideology, read David Harvey's book on neoliberalism, that has just been a kind of ideological veneer for unadulterated greed by the 1%.
What was your experience, though?
Well, my experience is that they allow me to express these views. Remember, I covered Eastern Europe. So if you wanted to hear Václav Havel, the only place you were going to hear Havel was Voice of America. Havel didn't support American imperialism or the U.S. war, but that was the only space that he had. And critics such as my Noam's completely blacked out. Nader, I mean, these people are just blacked out. And that's the goal. And once we throw in net neutrality, on the goal is to create tiers on the internet so that these left-wing sites become harder and harder to access. Go ahead.
So with our mainstream media increasingly corporatized and spewing out false narratives, with no one speaking up about the fate of people like Julian Assange, with no one talking about what Edward Snowden tried to warn us about, and with Google and Yahoo shutting down websites and deplatforming controversial sources every day, how can we possibly extricate ourselves from this situation without any broad voice? I mean, there's no kind of anything we can turn to.
Okay, so it's not like there aren't huge segments of the population that are conscious. I mean, you see the group here tonight. There are people who are conscious, and they know they're being lied to. And in the let's go back to the Stasi state of East Germany or the old Czech Republic, both of which I covered as I covered the Velvet Revolution. So what was amazing was how conscious people were, even with the imposition of the iron control of information. So when the Velvet Revolution took place, everyone knew that Havel, and the interesting thing about Havel, I was in the Magic Lantern Theater with him every night in Prague. The interesting thing about Havel is that he wasn't charismatic. He wasn't a particularly good speaker, but they knew he wasn't going to sell them out. He had the moral authority. And I've told this story, but I'll tell it again. There is, and fear will make people quiet, but they know. And so that whole winter, there were posters all over Prague of Jan Palach, who had a Charles University student who, to protest the 1968 Soviet invasion, had gone to Wenceslas Square, lit himself on fire, 4 days later died of his burns. His funeral which attracted hundreds of people, mostly students, was never broadcast by state media or covered. His grave became a shrine. They exhumed his remains, cremated his remains, gave them to his mother, said she couldn't bury them. That winter, his poster was everywhere. When the communist government fell, 10,000 people marched to Red Army Square and renamed it Jan Palach Square. Marta Kubasheva, the great singer, sang the Prayer for Marta, the anthem of defiance that was broadcast on the airwaves as the Soviet tanks rolled in. After the overthrow of Dubček and the imposition of the pro-Soviet government, her recording stock is destroyed. She's banned from the airwaves. Between 1968 and 1989, she works at an assembly line at a toy factory. I was in Wenceslas Square. She walked out on the balcony. She began to sing the Prayer for Marta, and every Czech in that crowd knew every word. That is the power of resistance, what Auden calls the ironic point of light that flashes out wherever the just exchange their messages. And that's why tyrants and despots are terrified of the truth, because people see it. People feel it. And there's more people out there that, you're right. And they are trying to shut it down. But the lies are now so egregious and so transparent that, a marginal critic such as myself suddenly becomes a threat because that truth is a threat. And so totalitarian systems are quite effective and the corporate state is quite effective at controlling the message. But I just traveled all over the country for this book. I can tell you people are far more conscious.
But with the internet completely in the power of these corporations and knowing everything about us and using it against us, how can that wasn't around in 1969? And this is what we face today. How can we overcome that and in a way that paralleled your experience in Europe?
Well, as despotic regimes deteriorate, they force resistance to create parallel systems. So I write about Anderson, Indiana, where these old former Catholic worker people have bought a warehouse. This is the end of the book on Chapter Freedom. And they are literally, because their stories are not told, people trapped in the gig economy, they literally print. They print it up and write it and disseminate it. I'm not saying, you're right to be concerned about it. But that doesn't mean they're going to win.
So I have a broad question. 2016 was probably the first time I had been politically engaged after being in the Army for some time and being deployed. That's a whole nother world to even explain that to people, that a culture that really doesn't want the story of what happens overseas in the name of empire to be told at all.
That's right.
But where does the left go from here? If I find it to be a very sad state. Jill Stein's name has pretty much been dragged through the mud. She can probably no longer effectively participate in the political system. The Democratic Party, as much as Ocasio-Cortez seems like she'll bring change, she still has to go up against a huge apparatus that will silence her, I think.
Yeah,
where do we go?
Where do we go? We go to the street. We look at people like Standing Rock. We look at all of the great radical movements that were shut out of power. I mean, we've gone through vicious periods of American history. I don't know if you know James Cone, but if you don't, you should read him, Crossing the Lynching. We've just lost him. This most important theologian in America and one of the great moral voices of our time. But as James kept saying, people will say Malcolm was so radical. Malcolm said what he said in Harlem. When King got up and said what he said in Montgomery, it meant that the next day walking down the street, he could be dead. And I think that we have to uncover or find again with us that kind of moral courage represented by the great figures of resistance. And we have to begin what we saw in South Africa, which brought down apartheid, which is non-cooperation. We have to do everything in our power to build alternative structures to pit power against power, and we have to do everything in our power to obstruct the workings of the corporate state. And that's what the Wobblies did. That's what the old CIO did. That's what they did in the civil rights movement. That's what the Communist Party did. That's what the Progressive Party did. We have antecedents. They erased this from American history. That's what the Bonus Marchers did, which, of course, MacArthur went in and evicted them by force. And, politics is a game of fear, and we have to make them frightened of us. That's our goal.
Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, Africans. I hope you're faring well where you are, and if you ain't faring well, please fare well where you are. You see, in Africa, we communicate using proverbs. We can communicate with this tree over here using proverbs. And that is how we connect with nature. And one of the proverbs I'm going to share with you today is about an elephant. Yes, the biggest land mammal, an elephant. So, when two elephants fight, two of them when they fight, the grass is the one which hurts the most, right? Because these things are very huge and they have long tusks. And they fight. Now the ground that is being stepped on, the grass, is the one that suffers the most, right? This is likened to a situation that is happening in America. Chris Hedges, who is a white journalist, he deals much more with economics and matters affecting Central America, Southern America, and some parts, of course, of Northern America. There's a speech that Chris Hedges made called America, the Farewell Tour. In this speech, he represents a sweeping indictment of national moral collapse, a deteriorating civilization, fractured by despair, corporate tyranny, and ideological extremism. When placed within the contemporary US economy, where Black Americans continue to endure systemic burdens, how does the speech that Chris Hedges made, which is called the Farewell Tour, how does it affect Black people? That is what we are going to uncover. And before we uncover that, I want us to listen to Chris Hedges give the speech, and then I shall get back by the end of the video, of course, where we shall also have a deep critical analysis. Let's dive in.
Societies that disintegrate, that societies in decay, communities in decay, create diseases of despair. That's not his term, but that's his idea. Pathologies that are expressed, that rise up from failed states, and those would be self-loathing, a sense of a lack of self-worth, alienation, all, as Durkheim says, that comes when you no longer have faith or belief in the established order, the established ideology, and established institutions. And that those kinds of pathologies are expressed in very self-destructive activities: gambling, hate crimes, sexual sadism, which is what pornography is. And although I went to the extreme. In my book, Empire of Illusion, I had written about the porn industry. But for this book, I went to kink.com. Hopefully none of you know what it is. I didn't know what it is. Derek Jensen had to tell me what it was. So they bought the old National Guard armory in San Francisco and run the largest BDSM operation in the world, which is live streamed. Look, it is torture. It is clearly, I mean, women are waterboarded and stuff. And then people will, people can stream in and say what they want done to the women. I mean, just appalling. But anyway, I went to these classes for which were held in the basement of the armory for DOMs, Dom, what do they call them? People who are dominant, people who like, what do they call? No, they're not dominatrix. They're dweeby guys who dress in black. And me sitting in the basement. I was not dressed in black. I actually wrote the gambling chapter out of the Trump Taj Mahal before I even knew Trump was even going to announce, which was inappropriate decay. I mean, there was mice all over the place, and the lights were burned out, and people were shooting up in the elevators, and most of the Taj Mahal was mothballed. It gives a nice picture of what's going to happen to the rest of the country if he remains in power. And then I was with these white hate groups, Knights of the Alt-Right, Proud Boys, which, of course, hate groups are a product of a diseased society, the Three Percenters. I was actually at one point at night around a bonfire with these guys in upstate New York, and I, of course, living in mortal fear that someone there would Google me. I was with my research assistant, who was terrified, quite justifiably so. And at one point, across the bonfire in the dusk, we saw 2 or 3 of these guys pointing at me. That's when, like, we got out, like, as fast as we. She actually, when we got to the car, she was so frightened she like crawled down to the floor. And their counterpart on the left. And I've been very critical, as some of you may know, of the Black Bloc and Antifa for much the same reason. I was in these deindustrialized pockets, Anderson, Indiana. And one of the things I like about, as a writer, I enjoy reporting. I like it because when I go out, it often shatters my own assumptions about what is happening. And it keeps me intellectually honest. So sometimes, I can go into a subject and think that I have a great body of knowledge. I wrote a book on the Christian right, which has become, unfortunately, I think, fairly relevant to our particular political situation. It's called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War on America. I was trying to reach out to them. And but I come out of the liberal church. My father was a Presbyterian minister, of course, as you heard. I'm a graduate of Harvard Divinity School, but I didn't really know much about the Christian right, and I went in there with all sorts of assumptions, and I would say even stereotypes about the kinds of people who embrace this form of fundamentalism, which I think is heretical. It's Christian heresy. But I couldn't listen to these stories of dislocation and pain, sexual, domestic abuse, struggles with addictions, evictions, bankruptcies, without having it break my heart. And I rewrote the whole book. The first chapter is called Despair. And it drove home to me what despair does. And the great study of one of the great studies of the rise of fascism by Fritz Stern is called The Politics of Cultural Despair. Hannah Arendt, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, holds up despair. Again, I think going back to Durkheim, that sense of worthlessness, that sense, and it propels people into a kind of magical thinking. I also, in the book, was with preppers and survivalists in Utah who have a little food in their bunker and a lot of ammunition. But I think that magical thinking, what anthropologists call it crisis cults, is a natural response to people who are just so overwhelmed by reality that they can't cope. And when I was in Anderson, so Anderson, Indiana used to have most of the big GM plants. And then Clinton gave the gift of NAFTA to the American working class, and GM hightailed it down to Monterrey, Mexico, where they pay workers without any benefits or job security $3 an hour. So your union salary of $25, and if you were a senior level overtime, you could be making $50 an hour. You had benefits. You had a pension plan. You were medically covered. You were in the UAW. You had job security. It's all vanished. And Anderson went into the kind of tailspin that many deindustrialized pockets of the United States went into, with all of the attendant problems, including, of course, the rise of a casino, like this whole idea of economic development through gambling. I watched that try to work in Yugoslavia, and it doesn't come to a good end. The idea that you're going to fill state revenue shortfalls with gambling. I mean, what was fascinating about Anderson is that most of these old UAW workers voted for Bernie Sanders. But when the general election came around, they voted for Trump because they weren't going to vote for Clinton after NAFTA. They were acutely aware, and perhaps their anger was even greater at the Democratic Party than the Republican Party, because it was the Democratic Party that had betrayed them, that had pretended to fight for their interests and their concerns, that continued to use the feel your pain language of traditional liberalism, but had thrust a knife in their back. And that betrayal is very dangerous. It is, Baldwin, when James Baldwin writes about, and one of his essays, he writes about why he thinks African-American middle-aged men don't have a midlife crisis the way white middle-aged men do. He said, because African-American men are not prone to believe in the American dream, given the forms of oppression that mutate and are protean and exist throughout have always existed throughout American history. And I think that there's a certain wisdom in that. That these, of course, the highest, and I write about suicide, the highest percentage of people who commit suicide in this country, which is an epidemic, are middle-aged white men. People who realized that, in fact, the society there is no place for them. That the quote-unquote American dream was a lie. And so what's happened, and it's been a process over a few decades, is that we have undergone what John Ralston Saul calls a coup d'etat in slow motion, a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion. Sheldon Wolin, if you don't know Sheldon Wolin, please read him. We just lost him a couple years ago. I did a 3-hour interview with him right before he died on YouTube, which was very humbling. I had reread all his books. I had pages of notes. You can watch it. It's remarkable intellectual pyrotechnics. There was just nothing that I couldn't throw at that guy. It was really quite spectacular. We had not been interviewed in over a decade. It was the last interview he gave. But his book, Democracy Incorporated, and then his masterpiece, Politics and Vision, are kind of seminal works. Politics and Vision is often considered by political scientists as one of the great political books on political philosophy produced in America in the 20th century, and I think that's not hyperbolic. Wolin calls the system inverted totalitarianism, in that he means that, like the late Roman Republic, you still have the facade. You have the iconography, the language, the institutions of an open society, of a democratic state, but internally corporations have seized all of the levers of power to render the citizen impotent. And of course, what that does, anytime a cabal seizes power, whether it's monarchical, communist, fascist, corporate, and redirects all of the systems of government and institutions towards their own empowerment and enrichment, then you get a form of political paralysis. The political system seizes up. It no longer responds to the rights and legitimate grievances of the citizenry, and in fact extracts more and more and more out of a population that is already under deep distress. And of course, that is what has happened, and that's one of the reasons why it's important to get out to places like Indiana, or I write out of Scranton, Pennsylvania, where the city went bankrupt or almost went bankrupt, and they had to sell off all of their utilities, their sewer system. This is not uncommon throughout deindustrialized centers in the United States. And of course, corporations buy it up and then jack up the prices. And these are, I think it's in the book, but I can't remember the average per capita income per family is like $40,000 a year or something in Scranton. Not much. And so you're extracting more and more and more from a population that has less and less and less. And that is the process. I mean, Trump has, of course, turbocharged the kleptocracy, but it was there before he came in. And so what we're facing and what we're producing and what's ahead of us is the inevitable collapse of the American empire. All of the warning signs that have brought down other empires throughout history are flashing red within the American empire. And I'll just tick a few of those off. One is the political paralysis, the inability of the system to address the injustices, the economic deprivation, the loss of rights of the population, and in fact to make it worse. The other, of course, is something that even Bernie Sanders doesn't like to talk about, and that is the bloated militarism and imperialism that is hollowing the country out from the inside. So you have now 17 years of warfare in the Middle East. There's a term, I don't know if people have read, Alfred McCoy wrote a good book, I think it's called This American Century. He's a great historian. But he talks about what he calls micro-militarism. It's a term that historians use. And what it is that late empires inevitably overreach. They carry out acts of military folly in an effort to recapture a lost power. For instance, in the Athenian Empire, they invade Sicily. Their entire fleet is sunk. Thousands of soldiers are killed, and the empire unravels. There are revolts throughout the empire. Or you look at the slow decline of the British Empire, which really began at the end of World War I, but culminated in 1956 when Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal and the British attempt to invade, and going back to Sacco's book, the Israelis take over Gaza for 100 days and carry out wholesale massacres, which is what his book is about, Footnotes in Gaza. And Eisenhower will not support them, largely because he won't give them credit to carry out this act of military adventurism, and they retreat in humiliation. And then what happens is the pound sterling is dropped as the world's reserve currency. And that, of course, is the death blow of the American empire, which is going to happen one day. Once the dollar is no longer the reserve currency, the economy seizes up. Imports become phenomenally expensive. We can't live off of the sale of treasury bonds, and because nobody wants them. And you can look at what happened to the British economy in the 50s if you want to know what's coming. And so you have a situation where you're squeezing your population harder and harder and harder for less and less and less. And this is a characteristic which Joseph Tainter writes about it in his great study, The Collapse of Complex Societies, where he looks at, I think it's 24 different civilizations, but he talks about that final moment when the elites retreat to the equivalent of the Forbidden City or Versailles, or in our country, it's what a writer in the New Yorker called Richistan, which means you fly on private jets and you never have any contact at all with anybody who doesn't make a few $1 million a year. And so they have no connection with the reality, and they squeeze. In this case, of course, it's through debt peonage. They've borrowed all these banks, Goldman Sachs, which is a criminal organization. Goldman Sachs, all of these corporations were able to borrow from the Fed trillions of dollars. I mean, there's various numbers, 4 or 7, and at virtually 0% interest. But it does have to be paid back. And so how's it paid back? It's extracted from us. That's $1.4 trillion in student debt. That is, you're late on your credit card, it's 28%. That is, even if you have health insurance, as anyone who has it can tell you, the costs keep rising astronomically in terms of copay, what they don't cover, what the pharmaceutical industry, which can jack up our, the Mylan, but that's just one of many examples in the EpiPen. So you're extracting more and more from a population, and how do you deal with this kind of calcification or failed democracy? And that is that at the same time you strip citizens of their rights. You reinterpret constitutional rights. You overturn them by judicial fiat. So, for instance, with Citizens United, which allows the Koch brothers to control with dark money or Sheldon Adelson, these figures, our elections, it becomes the right to petition the government or a form of free speech. This is how Citizens United is justified. Edward Snowden exposes the fact that we are the most surveilled, watched, monitored, eavesdropped population in human history. And I covered the Stasi state in East Germany. And, of course, nothing is done to restore the constitutional right of privacy. And if you wonder why it's so dangerous that they have everything on every one of us, including medical records. You go back to Hannah Arendt's great book, Origins of Totalitarianism, and she writes about how despotic governments take information or have files, information on every citizen, so that at the moment that they seek to criminalize that person or a group, they can twist whatever information they have to justify it as a crime. We also have, courtesy of Barack Obama's signing of the 2011 National Defense Authorization Act, Section 1021, which overturns the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act, which had before prohibited the military from acting as a domestic police force. And as some of you may know, I sued Obama in federal court, and to the chagrin of the national security state, won. And the very courageous judge, Catherine Forrest, ruled in our favor and issued a temporary injunction. And within hours of that injunction, lawyers from the NSA had flown up and demanded in the name of national security that she reinstate this act. Now, this act allows the military to seize U.S. citizens, strip them of due process, and hold them indefinitely in military facilities. And in her opinion, which is worth reading, she said this opens the path for the government to criminalize an entire group of people. And she cites the 110,000 Japanese Americans who were interned in World War II. You militarize police forces, and you create legal and physical mechanisms among the demonized segments of your population, so that at a moment that the country becomes restive, with a flick of a switch, you can impose martial law or tyranny. So in marginal communities, you have already reigns of terror. 94% of the people in our prison system never get a jury trial. They're forced to plea out. And I have taught in prison for 10 years, and the students I have with the longest sentences invariably went to trial, did not commit the crime for which they are charged, went to trial, although many people who are forced to plead guilty didn't commit the crime. And nobody deserves, almost no one in the system deserves the length of sentences or the conditions they're held under. And they get the longest sentences because it's a message sent to everyone else, which is basically, don't try this. I mean, they won't peel off the charges. And that's how a plea works. They stack all sorts of charges. Even they know you didn't do it. I mean, they love to put kidnapping on, no matter what you did, because it's 25 years. So, and it will go back to Arendt. So Arendt writes about, she herself is expelled from Germany, stripped of her German citizenship, finds herself in France. And she writes about the plight of the stateless. And she said, once you create a mechanism within your society whereby for a segment of that society, rights become privileges. And we see it with what's happening to undocumented people around us. Then you have the infrastructure and the legal tools so that those privileges can be taken away from everyone. And let's be very clear, just to conclude, that our corporate masters will stop at nothing if they feel that their profits are being impeded. And the great example of that, and I was out there, is Standing Rock. So here you had a nonviolent protest by water protectors to safeguard their own, not only their water, but their land. And the response of the state, and this was under Obama, was incredibly violent. So over 700 arrests, the use of attack dogs. We're all talking about nonviolent protesters. Sub-freezing temperatures, you're using water cannons laced with pepper spray against people. Constant infiltration. And this is something that I keep telling the kids who I loved in Zuccotti they weren't quite aware of, the extent to which the state is able to monitor and infiltrate. Although there were moments in Zuccotti when it was out of a Doonesbury cartoon, because some guy who clearly lifted weights and was in his 30s would show up in a baseball cap and tell everyone he was at Reed College, but he forgot his ID card. And the question was always the same. After a little chit-chat, he goes, so who are the leaders? That was always, and I mean the power of Occupy was that everything was transparent. We're not going to win this game unless we're transparent. And it gets the whole issue if somebody wants to ask about nonviolence, which is the only way we're going to win this game. And so I remember one of these cops went to the head of the medical. There was a medical tent in there, and said to the woman running the medical tent, so eventually came out, so who are the leaders? And she goes, I am. He goes, oh, really? He goes, well, what's your title? She goes, God. But what's not funny is that because these activists were using electronic media, but digital communication, they knew who was important. And under Obama, coordinated national effort, they shut down Occupy, which for me was one of the great tragedies of our time, because if the state had responded rationally to the very moderate demands of the Occupy movement, forgiving student debt, universal health care, a jobs program, especially targeted at people under the age of 25, it would have actually gone a long way to ameliorating the pressure, which has now only gotten worse. But unfortunately, the state did not respond rationally. And I know I'm a little over, but just let me close by talking about Trump. Trump is the symptom. He's not the disease. And I watched this same kind of political deformity and deterioration in Yugoslavia. And you can go back and look at Weimar. Eric Vogelin writes about it in Hitler and the Germans, where he talks about how, this idea that Hitler mesmerized or hypnotized is ridiculous. What it tapped into was a kind of inchoate rage and frustration and sense of betrayal, because after the 1929 crash, the socialist government, the Social Democrats under Ebert in Weimar, imposed the same kinds of programs of austerity that were pushed on him by the banks. So they even suspended, if you can believe it, unemployment insurance. People couldn't even get unemployment insurance. And the Nazis were in 28 were polling in the single digits after the crash, of course, and the policy of austerity, and then it gets into the whole. We can go back to Rosa Luxemburg and the Freikorps and all that. But the people embraced these figures who were. Everybody knew they were buffoonish, in the same way that everyone knows Trump is buffoonish, as the same way that everybody knew Radovan Karadzic or Slobodan Milosevic or Franjo Tudjman were buffoonish, because of the anger at the system. And my fear, as I watch the Democratic Party and the mainstream commercial media, is that they don't get it. They continue to play this reality show game. Did Russia try and interfere? Well, yeah, probably. But Trump is not a product of Russian interference. Trump is a product of grotesque social inequality. And, of course, the Democratic Party doesn't want to address that issue because they are an appendage of corporate power. Yes, they're not they are on the spectrum of corporate power that doesn't want to be identified as a racist or xenophobe or a homophobe. But they do nothing to halt the cannibalization of corporations, and of course, that a part of that is the wars that we are waging. It makes no sense to remain. The Taliban now controls more territory in Afghanistan than they did when we went in. So why are we still there? Well, I mean, look at the stock prices of Raytheon, Halliburton. A cruise missile costs what, $1.1 million? Let's drop 50 of them on Libya. It's good for money. It's good for profit for the war industry, but it's not good for anyone over there, and it's certainly not good for us. And then I guess I'll happy to take any questions anyone has.
And I agree with you for the most part. It's very depressing, and you didn't even mention climate change.
No, I didn't. It's in the book. That's the pick-me-up chapter.
But I think I'm older than you, and yes, the empires have collapsed, but this happened very quickly. Within the scope of my lifetime. I was born in the 40s. I grew up in the 50s in Massachusetts, and the country was on a roll. Not everyone, not the blacks in the South. We didn't know about. Well, I didn't know about it. But the people who were left had gotten through the Depression. They had gotten through the war. They had been led by Roosevelt, and we felt that progress was just inevitable. And in the 60s, because the country was doing so well, it seemed okay to open things up. My late husband was at the EEOC. The whole idea was to be more inclusive. And it all sort of began to turn in 1980, or in the 70s with Nixon, in 1980 with Ronald Reagan and Milton Friedman, which gave you this corporate culture. But it's happened so fast that I don't see why it can't still be turned around.
Okay. It's a good question. It started actually earlier, because it started with, you had the collapse of capitalism in the 1930s.
Right.
Roosevelt was a product of the radical movements. The Communist Party, we've kind of erased the Communist Party from American history. I'm not a communist, but they, the whole sit-ins that Martin Luther King used, Ruskin was aware of this. They'd been used in the 1920s by the Communist Party, and that's why Paul Robeson or W.E. Du Bois joined the Communist Party, because even the socialists under Debs were hostile to African Americans, and so Roosevelt astutely understood. I mean, Roosevelt said that his greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism.
Right.
And he understood that if the private sector didn't create jobs for American citizens, given the unemployment,
good jobs,
we better create jobs. So he created 12-minute jobs. If elderly people are literally starving or malnourished in their apartments, then we better create Social Security. And the corporate oligarchs made two fatal mistakes. One, they went after the radicals. They recreated the Red Scares of the 1920s in the 1950s.
Right.
And Ellen Schrecker has written two very fine books on this. And you forget how pervasive that purging was. And we're not talking about necessarily communists. We're talking about anybody with a social conscience. So the FBI was going into high schools with a list. This is in Schrecker's book, saying him, her, out. No evidence, nothing. And they're blacklisted. The assault on journalism, that's how I.F. Stone ends up in his basement writing I.F. Stone's Weekly. The assault on Hollywood, on entertainment. So that began to destroy the popular radical movements, which, as Zinn points out, were the forces that opened up our democracy. We have a closed system. Every time I hear about the deification of the founding fathers, I just want to fall over. These people were racist. They supported the genocide. I mean, read what they wrote about eradicating the Indians. Washington was the wealthiest man in the United States. They were misogynists, on and on and on. And we paid for it with blood. We had the bloodiest labor wars of any industrialized country. So they went after the radical movements, then they went after the liberal class. And I wrote a book on it called Death of the Liberal Class, where, and as Chomsky points out, I told Noam for Death of the Liberal Class, everything I learned about the liberal class, I learned from Noam Chomsky, so I should have put by Chris Hedges and Noam Chomsky, except I didn't get his permission to do it. As Chomsky points out, the liberal class was never designed to be the political left. It was designed to be the safety valve, what Karl Popper writes about in the Enemies of the Open Society. It was designed to ameliorate, to adjust the system the way Roosevelt did. And so they eviscerated the liberal establishment, and then we got the great traitor of liberalism, Bill Clinton, who really sold American people down the river. And we can just tick it off. NAFTA, the greatest betrayal of working men and women since the Taft-Hartley Act. Deregulating the FCC so these troglodytes from Clear Channel and Fox News can consolidate control. We have about 6 corporations or 5 control 90% of what people listen to. It's indoctrinated crap. Talk about it's fake news. I mean, real fake news. He passes the 94 Omnibus Crime Bill, so the prison population explodes from 700,000. He destroys Glass-Steagall. He destroys welfare, and 70% of the original recipients in the old welfare program were children. And every time I heard Hillary Clinton talk about her concern for mothers. So, and Obama wasn't any better, but that's another story. So that we created this. It was a gradual process, and in that process, we deindustrialized. So, as Charles Mayer, the Harvard historian, says, by the 1970s, we had shifted from an empire of production to an empire of consumption, meaning that we were borrowing to maintain both a lifestyle and a military we could no longer afford, and now we're paying for it, and that's a long answer. Go ahead.
Thank you.
I agree with every word that you've spoken tonight, but I want to pick up with what that lady said at the very end. We must not get defeatist. We have to think that there is a way out of this, and to describe it is very important, but we have to start structuring our thought. I mean, for example, all of us many people are in the system. So there, excuse me, there is a leverage of people to change their minds, to change the philosophy. And I'd like you to speak a little bit about that, because I don't want us to get so down that we really think we can't get out of it.
I mean, this gets to the whole issue of hope. I come out of war. I spent 20 years covering war. I don't share the culture's mania for hope. I covered very bleak situations. I was in Sarajevo during the war. And my job as a war correspondent was to make a very cold, rational calculation about the weapon systems around me and the possibility for destruction, and then to act. And she mentioned climate change, which I haven't spoken about. But, I mean, we've known about climate change since 1902. And we've done nothing, which kind of implodes the new atheists. Chomsky calls them the religious fanatics for the state religion, Sam Harris, etc. It implodes this idea that we're rational human beings. And I think that, Reinhold Niebuhr has...
But sir, are you in such are you in such despair yourself? I mean this not as a criticism, but have you given up much hope?
But I have. But the fact is, you can't use the word hope if you don't resist.
Okay.
And so we have to carry out, because the very act of resistance or rebellion at that moment makes you a free human being. But at the same time, it doesn't do us any good not to grasp the crisis, the mortal crisis that we face, not only as a nation, but as a species. And I think that is the great existential struggle of the moment, whereby we have to see reality for what it is, and then we have to resist. Okay. But most people who rebel, the great rebels, Toussaint Louverture or Sitting Bull or Malcolm, or they but in the eyes of the world, they didn't succeed. But in fact, what they did is hold up that other narrative. And I would then go into my own background as a seminarian. I once asked Daniel Berrigan, the great radical priest and poet, how he defined faith. And he said, faith is the belief that the good draws to it the good, even if empirically everything around us says otherwise. And I think that if we are going to resist successfully, we are going to have to do so, not in an orthodox way. Emma Goldman, fundamentally, I think, had a deep religious impulse. We are going to have to believe, as Berrigan says, that the good draws to it the good, even if empirically everything around us gets worse. But Sartre writes about it, the utopianism of the practical. I can't remember his exact phrase. My son's here; he can tell us. But we are going to have to see how dire it is. And look, I'm not the only one in this room who has kids. And even if we fail, we have to. I want my kids to look back and say he tried. So I think on the one hand, we do have to face how bleak it is. On the other hand, we can't let that despair cripple us. But I look at this, this kind of inevitable human progress or technology will save us as foolish as the denial of global warming.
Thank you.
So now, after carefully listening to Chris Hedges give his speech about the fallout of America, here is my deep critical analysis, as I promised. You see, as of August 2025, which is the month we are in today, the US economy is exhibiting classic signs of stagflation, right? A troubling combination of slowing growth and a rising inflation. So we have stagflation, stagnant growth and increasing inflation, right? So weak July job data, persistent inflation pressures, especially from tariffs, and dampening consumer momentum underscore this fragility. Economists also warn of a milder but still serious stagflation light, right, scenario with rising prices, diminished jobs growth, only about 773,000 new jobs in July, and elevated inflation pressures tied to trade barriers. Meanwhile, markets are usually buoyant, propelled by big tech and investor optimism around interest rate cuts through broader sectors which lag behind. Political maneuvers, tariffs, executive overreach, and strain on institutional credibility have raised comparisons to emerging markets and unsettled investor confidence. Public finances has painted a grim picture. The national debt has surged past $37 trillion years sooner than expected, fueled by expansive pandemic-era spending and recent legislative tax cuts. The deficit is projected by the OECD to rise above 8% of America's GDP, which will cross the 100% debt to GDP threshold by 2026, right? That is the first thing I discovered, or rather the first thing that has been rendered upon by Chris Hedges. I entitled it "The U.S. Economic Landscape in 2025," how it looks like. We have a stagnation in economic growth, we have inflation, we have tariffs, and then we have debts, right? So another thing is, the second one is stark inequalities. You see, stark inequalities. But now the question which remains is, who bears the burden of these stark inequalities? In such economic distress, historically marginalized communities, particularly Black Americans, bear disproportionate burdens. Home ownership remains a glaring disparity. Around 45.1% of Black Americans owned homes in early 2021, compared to 65.3% of all Americans, with minimal progress since, despite legal safeguards. A broader systemic gap persists, according to McKinsey report. At current rates of progress, racial parity in outcomes between Black and white Americans could take 100 to 320 years, right? This includes disparities in economic opportunity, wealth, education, and beyond, right? Now, the third division is how Chris Hedges has given an impartial diagnosis, right? It's broad, but not deep enough. Chris Hedges' narrative, the speech he made, represent a despair and a corporate rot as a universal affliction. His portrayal of marginalized communities as emblematic of social decline loses specificity, right? In a 2025 world defined by ricocheting inflation, stalled growth, historical debt, and deep racial economic fractures, that broad brush impartiality obscures differentiated experiences. Tariffs, right? While these may slow CPI inflation, overall, their brunt is felt hardest by households already behind the wealth curve, raising food, energy, and housing costs disproportionately for Black Americans, many of whom lack wealth cushions. And then we have the stagflation. The slow job growth and persistent inflation place low income. Black workers in particular peril. Marginal employment sectors, retail, service, caregiving, traditionally overrepresented by Black workers, are hit hardest during downturns, right? And then we have the wealth inequality. The rapid decline in real income for lower wage groups further compounds the challenges, especially as home ownership remains elusive and intergenerational wealth gaps persist, right? Even if Hedges astutely captures the universal malaise, his analysis lacks the racial structural lens necessary for fully understanding how capitalism, policy, and despair intersect, especially for the Black Americans, right? So this man is just, we can't call him a prophet of doom, but we can say he's a prophet of truth. Forging an expanded framework, race at the forefront of collapse. To sharpen Chris Hedges' vision of light in 2025, here is what we have to consider. First, economic policy and Black resilience. Federal layoffs and shrinking government services, including care, education, and support, hit communities of color hardest, since minority communities rely disproportionately on public sector employments and social services. And then we have wage stagnation and labor fragility, which remain entrenched. Even small setbacks in job growth or soaring costs, tariffs, rent, and food ripple painfully through Black households in America, lacking those Black families in America that are lacking deep savings, right? And then we have the debt and financial vulnerability. With mounting national debt, emergency funding for housing, health, and education, already stretched thin, is at even greater risk. Black Americans disproportionately rely on these support structures. Then we have reparation and structural justice. Importantly, Congress has reintroduced the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposal for African Americans, right, in 2025. This is suggesting a national conversation around compensatory justice and economic equity. Chris Hedges' narrative could be powerfully augmented by engaging with reparations discourse, not merely as moral redress, but as structurally economic intervention in the face of collapse, right? So what is the final verdict to this? The grass trembles unequally. Remember the elephants and the grass. According to Chris Hedges, the speech he made, the farewell tour, it is compelling in its indictment of moral and institutional decay. Yet, in the 2025 American economy marked by stagnation, inflation, debt, and racial inequality, his impartial lens becomes perilously colorblind, right? We have universal despair, which is real but not uniformly distributed. We have macroeconomic collapse and corporate monopoly that hurt all. But Black Americans fall deeper into the abyss, or it's like an economic abyss, right? An abyss is a very, very deep hole. We have also reparative justice, which is essential to meaningful solution, but peripheral to the narrative, right? To deepen his critique, Chris Hedges would need to, first of all, embed racial economic disparities within his structural analysis. The second, he'll need to highlight how policy decision tariffs, deregulation, deficits amplify inequality alongside racial lines, right? And then the third one would be Chris Hedges would have to embrace reparations and racial justice. You see, being a central theme, rather than marginal to America's potential healing. You see, to conclude, fleshing out America, the farewell tour in a light of 2025 economic context exposes the insufficiency of an impartial, flat portrayal of American decline. The grass doesn't merely suffer, it is scorched everywhere, but some patches are more scorched than others. Black Americans enmeshed in systemic economic deprivation, right, face intensified consequences of tariffs, stagflation, shrinking opportunity, and mounting debt, right? A truly understanding leader, such as I believe Trump can also become a truly transformative leader, right? He should put into account, even though he's trying to make policies that he believes are right for the black people or for the entire America, he should consider even the lowest of the citizen, of his own citizens, right? So these policies hurt everyone, right? But there are people with which it hurts more. See, when the elephant is stepping down, of course the whole grass will suffer, but there are parts which suffer more than the others. You see, in suffering, blacks get more. In having good things such as better education, better health, better food, better roads, we have the least. So it really doesn't make sense, right? It really doesn't make sense. A transformative leader should transform all this and make it become something tangible, make it become something unforgettable, right? To ensure that all citizens are satisfied. That is how we can see a better America. Because right now, the policies that Trump placed, such as the tariff cuts, have caused a lot of problems, right? Placing tariffs on Chinese goods, placing tariffs here and there, the deportation, all these has brought a stagflation to the United States of America. Stagflation is a stagnant economic growth. Farmers are going bankrupt, right? Who is begging? Like, it's all chaos, right? And you know, agriculture is the backbone of many economies, right? So if farmers then themselves are going bankrupt and are begging and asking for loans and help from blacks, yet the government exists, it tells you how bad the system is. It tells you that the economy is stagnant. You see, things which used to be cheap are now more expensive, right? For instance, this bottle over here, let's say it costed $2, right, in the past. Right now it might cost $5. The same thing. So you use a lot of money to buy a small thing. That is inflation. All this is caused by bad policing. A bad policing that has issued issued by Donald Trump. I think his advisors are advising him wrong, or he has his own reasons for doing so. Yeah. Do share your thoughts in the comment section. I'd really love to hear from you and what you think. See you in the next one.